The Toolbox, Strategies for Crafting Social Impact, offers a set of 9 tools to help you build a better world. We are in this moment of tangled challenges: war, pandemic, climate crisis, racial reckoning, and it all can feel kind of overwhelming. A lot of us are trying to figure out, how do we do good in this tangled moment? And so I wrote the Toolbox as an attempt to offer people in whatever sector a set of tools that had worked for building a better world at some moment in the past. But I wanted to offer a set and not a single one, because it's become clear to me that there's no single answer. There's no easy answer. Instead, there are tools. There are different ways of thinking and acting to try and build a better world. And that's what I've tried to capture in this book. There are now millions and millions of people who are employed full-time to make the world better. In the US alone, the nonprofit sector employs 13 million people. There are millions of government officials whose job every day is to make their community better. There are millions of corporate leaders who either are creating a company with a fundamental social purpose, or at least trying to be thoughtful and serious about the consequences of that company's work. And we don't even have the right nomenclature. We don't have words to describe this profession of trying to make the world better, even though there are millions of people in it. What a compliment to humanity that we have figured out how to make it people's job to support each other, to support their communities, to support the ecosystems around them. What a challenge we face to equip those people with the tools they need to do a good job. But that's a challenge that I, for one, am glad that we're facing. If we do a good job of preparing those people, preparing us to tackle the great challenges that are in front of us, I have faith that humanity can figure it out, and that we can go into this uncertain future and make a difference that lasts, and set up our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids to continue that process of learning and building and doing in a way that we can be proud of, that leaves open a pathway towards a brighter future. In the Toolbox, there are 9 tools. They range from tools that are focused at the individual level, like storytelling or behavioral economics or design thinking, to those that operate at a group level, like game theory or community organizing. Also tools that help us get a sense of scale, like mathematical modeling. And then those that look at a broader context: markets, institutions, complex system science. And across this range of tools, you have different ways of looking and understanding how we think about the world and how we act within it. There are 2 lessons in design thinking that I believe are essential for applying to the work of social change, whether you are in a nonprofit organization, at a foundation, in a corporation, in a government agency. And the 2 lessons are so simple as to seem obvious, but I think if you look at the record, you'll see that they are not applied with the consistency that the world demands. And the first lesson is the importance of listening, and a stance of absorbing information from those who are closest to the action. And the second is iteration, to have a cycle or a process where you're constantly learning, measuring the results of your actions and applying that to a next iteration. And in that way, design thinking is consistent with the ethos of the Toolbox, because you don't enter a design thinking process believing that you know the answer. Instead, you enter with a process and a mindset that opens you up to the possibilities and allows you to experiment and learn and hopefully get to a solution. In the COVID-19 pandemic, we've lost a million fellow citizens here in the United States, millions more across the planet. But we've also lost, I think, a bit of innocence. I think we have been reminded of the power of nature. We have been reminded of the fragility of some of our institutions. And so to me, the question is, can we take that as a lesson, as a learning that we apply to the work of building something better as we face other grand challenges ahead of us, like climate change? And so the pandemic, I hope, has brought to those working for social good, whether in the nonprofit sector or in business or in government, both a bit of humility and a recognition that what may have seemed stable around us is not so stable, but also some confidence that change is possible, because we did see during the pandemic an extraordinary societal ability to pivot and to shift. We saw this in the nonprofit sector as organizations figured out, how are we going to do fundraising online if we can't meet for the annual gala? And you saw this happening. You saw jazz trios doing fundraisers online, providing a connection to art and beauty to folks who were stuck at home, and a connection to those institutions that mattered in their community. You saw food distribution happening not just at a food pantry, but in the parking lots of giant stadiums. And so we saw that the social sector, broadly defined, can actually move and come alive in moments of crisis. And so my hope is that we can take that ethos, that sense of potential, and apply it going forward. Because the pandemic is not the last challenge that we'll face. It's not the last dislocation that will shift our context so radically that we have to reassess how we've done things. The first line of the Hippocratic Oath that physicians take is do no harm. And I think it's important for those of us who are working for a better world to start with sufficient humility to recognize that it is possible to do harm while you're trying to do good. And in fact, many of the tragedies of the past rise out of an authentic attempt to do something good. And there are a few ways that we can address this. One is having quantitative measurement systems that allow us to get a sense in the short term of our traction, the success that we are or are not having in our work in whatever sector, on whatever social issue. And then the second is to have a feedback loop that is qualitative, that is human. And the best way to do that is to actually ask the people that you're trying to serve if what you're doing is helping, and to have your ears open to signals that maybe something's backfiring, maybe something's working, maybe there's an unintended consequence. Approaching our work with honesty and humility is not just ethically important, but it's strategically important. If we are going to head off some of those challenges or negative consequences that might come down the road. And this is broadly a theme in the book, that the ethical is the strategic, and that being thoughtful about the experiences of others, the distribution of consequences, bringing a stance of deep truthfulness to your work, even when that means that you have to admit that something you're doing is going off the rails or is having this unintended consequence. That sort of an ethical stance positions you better for success in the long term. One of the lessons that I have learned over the course of my career is the limitations of perspective, and that each of us brings one view, one set of experiences that offers a lens that we understand the world through. But it's imperfect. It's not complete. And that ethos has, led me to try and hold in my head both humility of perspective and confidence that each perspective matters. So, for example, for me as a straight white man to write in my book stories about the civil rights movement, write about Black Lives Matter, that is fundamentally limited by the nature of my own experience. It is fundamentally limited by the views that I've had and the ways that I've been treated. All of us have to figure out both the limitations and the advantages of our own perspective. And to bring with that, one hopes, enough humility to learn, but then enough confidence to still act. Because one thing we want to avoid is being frozen by guilt, to recognize the advantages of our own perspective or experience in such a way that it leads us to not act. That recognition needs to instead lead us to act, but to act with humility and with a recognition that our experience and our perspective is only part of the broader picture. Technology offers both promise and peril for the work of social good. It offers promise because fundamentally it offers access to connection and information. And each of those is a fundamental ingredient of effective social change. We aren't able to act solely on our own and hope to shift the contours of the world. We have to act together. And the right sort of connections allow us to act together as a whole, not just as a stack of individuals, but a whole greater than the sum of its parts. And technology does facilitate that sort of connection in extraordinary ways. And another critical ingredient to effective social change is information, whether it's information about which nonprofit is most effective that a donor uses to help allocate their capital, or information about which intervention has the best evidence that a nonprofit uses to determine what their strategy will be, or information that an investor uses to think about the social consequences of their investment portfolio. Information is a lifeblood of social change, and technology helps to enable that. But at the same time, we have to recognize, as I think all of us have come to, that these technologies have accelerated the pace of human evolution in a way. And we are all just trying to catch up. And in particular, we're trying to catch up cognitively and emotionally. Our brains are overwhelmed by the number of connections, the sheer quantity of information. And we have to develop new techniques and a new kind of psychological resilience to handle this. It will play out differently for each person and in each sector. But my hope is in the social sector that we can capitalize on the power of connection and of information while still maintaining that fundamental humanity that isn't mediated by technology. What we can do is keep a sharp eye on how things are evolving. We can experiment along the way. We can learn and change and pivot. And all through that, figure out how to hold on to that fundamental human character and human passion that drives the desire to make a better world. And do that in a way that is enabled by technology instead of obscured by technology. The debate over ESG has highlighted some critical questions. These are questions that we're going to be wrestling with for decades. Questions about, to what degree can we actually measure the social impact of an individual company or an individual investment? To what degree is that correlated with the financial performance of that company or investment? And these are exactly the kinds of questions that we as a species should be wrestling with from now until the end of time, because we're never going to get perfect answers to them. But the fact that we are engaged in these sort of debates is, to me, indicative that we're growing up, that capitalism is growing up. It's confronting the consequences of an untrammeled market, confronting the challenges of understanding the consequences of our actions. And that's really healthy. And I'm kind of proud of the markets for wrestling with these questions. We need a better policy environment that's sending clearer signals about the consequences of, for example, negative externalities. And we need the emotional maturity to wrestle with these sort of questions in a way that doesn't shut down the conversation and instead reinvigorates it, instead gets investors and government officials and corporate executives to the table to really engage with the question of, all right, my company pollutes a lot. What are we going to do about this? Or, my products make people sick. What are we going to do about this? Another thing that's interesting about the ESG debate is how parallel it is to a set of debates in the nonprofit sector. In that, in the nonprofit sector for many, many years, the only data that was comprehensively available was financial data from the IRS Forms 990 that nonprofits filed, this, at least in US context. And that led to things like what we call the overhead myth, the idea that the best way to judge nonprofit performance is by looking at financial ratios such as overhead, which led to all sorts of negative unintended consequences, with donors more focused on an accounting ratio than they were on the results created by the nonprofit. And it's taken years and years and millions of dollars to build up a kind of infrastructure to gather information about what really matters, which is the results of the work of nonprofits. And in the ESG debate and the broader socially responsible investing debate, we see a similar tension between the financial data that provides a fundamental and critical baseline and the programmatic or results data that helps us as a society understand what comes out of these organizations, what are the results of their work. And these tensions can be very healthy, they can be very productive. And I believe that people, whether individual donors giving $50 to a homeless shelter or a private equity firm thinking about a multi-billion-dollar investment, that we as humans are fully capable of holding in our heads these parallel sets of information about financial reality, and then also about the social and environmental consequences of the work of a given organization or a given company.